You're having a wonderful Sabbath day. This morning, I'd like to talk about a man named Gaius. In going through Chronicles and looking at the history of Israel, as we've been doing downstairs, and you think about the good times and the bad times, and Israel went through a lot of bad times. But if you look at modern history and the New Testament church, it's not that much different. During the time of John and Paul, the church had terrible problems, just as it does today. In Timothy, 2 Timothy particularly, Paul is admonishing Timothy to go out there and tell him about conditions, the way they're going to be and the way they're becoming. People won't hear the truth. They'll gather fables. In fact, we're in a fabled time right now, this season. But let me give you a little synopsis of kind of the progression of the New Testament church, and I guess we could go into more detail if we wanted to cover it. But when Jesus was crucified on the cross, Jesus told John to take care of his mother. We find that we go to the first two books of Revelation. We find that John is on the Isle of Patmos, and he is writing a letter to the 7 churches of Asia. If you look on a map of Asia, these are churches that kind of make a string. If you kind of map in the back of your Bible or whatever, but those churches were having problems. Paul said that all of Asia had turned against him. Paul also said that there would be a falling away, that they would turn from the truth. And we're going to focus on 3 John today, but really that's what happened. And when you get into Revelation, it says that the woman would flee to the wilderness, and that's what has happened. That's why you find little groups here, little groups there, but usually when it comes to bureaucracy and how churches form themselves, corruption is a natural order of things, because when people tend to, I'm not saying organization is good. I think Paul and the churches of the primitive church were set up a certain way. There were elders and deacons, and that's the way that it was set up. There was no great councils that we see any evidence of. But the core, the center of worship for Christians should be their group that they associate with. Those are brothers and sisters in the Lord, and those are the people that you learn to trust, and you identify those who are faithful. And we worship together because we have shared beliefs. But just as back in Israel's time, when men followed their own devices, their own so-called good ideas, and they started trusting in other things, they fell by the wayside, and God had to reprimand them, and eventually Israel was cast off, and then Judah was carried off into captivity, and they never again ruled their country. Not until 1948 has Israel ever ruled their country, and even that is not like what is to come. I think these things are just kind of a foreshadow. There may be a sign to let us know that something's coming, but Israel is not established as a country, not spiritual Israel. The Israel that there's right now does not recognize Christ And salvation only comes through Christ. So there's certainly some changes that are coming. But give me back to what happened to the churches. By the time, you read Revelations, the first and second church, Jesus is sending the message through his angel to John that the churches need to get it together. They're losing it, basically. But by the time you get to Nicene, you hear of the Nicene Council, the churches are already, they're fighting in the streets. So you read the history books, and there's always big problems. Constantine brought this council together because he wanted to bring peace in the kingdom. The churches that history says the history books and theologians teach us as our forefathers that was a corrupt system already. We shouldn't look to them for an example of what we should believe and we need to look to the scriptures. But anyway, I'm just kind of getting the idea of what's the situation going on in 3rd John and 2nd John, actually John's Gospels. The 3rd John only has 14 verses. I think 2nd John only has 13 verses. And 1st John has about 3 chapters. Then we have the book of John, which is a good volume. But even though they are short, they are they're a glimpse of what's going on in the churches. And I want to go ahead and read through 3rd John. It's 14 verses. It says, the elder to beloved Gaius. King James says, well-beloved, which is a good translation. It's the well-beloved. He thought highly of Gaius, whom I love in truth. Beloved, I pray that you may prosper in all things and be in health, just as your soul prospers. For I rejoiced greatly when brethren came and testified of the truth that is in you. Just as you walk in the truth, I have no greater joy than to hear that my children walk in truth. Beloved, you do faithfully whatever you do for the brethren and for strangers who have borne witness of your love before the church. If you send them forward on their journey in a manner worthy of God, you do well, because they went forth for his name's sakes, taking nothing from the Gentiles, we therefore ought to receive such that we may become fellow workers for the truth. I wrote to the church, but Diotrephes, who loves to have the preeminence among them, in other words, he's proud, does not receive us. Therefore, if I come, I will call to mind his deeds, which he does, prating against us with malicious words, and not content with that he himself does not receive the brethren, and forbids those who wish to, putting them out of the church. Beloved, do not imitate what is evil, but what is good. He who does good is of God, and he who does evil has not seen God. Demetrius has a good testimony from all and from the truth itself, and we also bear witness, and you know that our testimony is true. I had many things to write, but I do not wish to write to you with pen and ink, and I hope to see you shortly, and we shall speak face to face. Peace to you. Our friends greet you. Greet the friends by name. And obviously, this is before Paul was put on the isle as a prisoner. He was still able to come and go. But he identifies Gaius as being a hospitable character, a friend of those who are working in the gospel. He identifies Gaius as a spiritual man. I think these books of John really almost gives us like a fly on the wall view of what's going on in the church at this time. And he recognizes that there's a lot of things going wrong in the church because people have come in and they've pretty much taken over a lot of the leadership. It's the very thing that Paul warned against in his writings, his epistles, and that wolves would come in. But, you know, in this chapter, you know, it's very similar to 2 John. You know, in 2 John, there's a lot of a lot of key words like love and truth, and we find these same things in 3 John, but there's a significant difference in the midst of all these similarities between 2nd and 3rd John. And it's simply, you know, you remember in 2 John, he addressed the elect lady. And John was writing to the church. He was warning them that they shouldn't admit false teachers into their home, which, you know, effectively they shouldn't allow false teachers to come into their fellowship. And, you know, he was warning her, the church, that she, you know, she was given a critique of how to identify whether a teacher is true or false. 3 John is written to Gaius. I don't know if it's because he doesn't think the message will get through to the church, but he commends Gaius highly for the very fact that he's admitted churches and you know, teachers and that into the church where he resides. He doesn't spend a lot of time on what the church shouldn't be, but he's commending him highly for his conduct and how he conducts himself and the testimony that he has. Instead of telling them who not to admit into the church, he's telling them that those true preachers that are out there, they're being rejected by this other person in leadership, that they need to be brought in and used, and because they're willing to go out and spread the gospel. But there's a problem in the church, and Gaius is not that problem. And he's telling him that you know, he plans to come, but you know, he's commended him for being, you know, a courageous, gracious, those who accept the missionaries as a host in his name. You know, these two epistles kind of give kind of two sides of the gospel of love. You know, in the first epistle, in the second epistle of John, is telling the church to use a tough love. You know, don't just open the doors to anybody. They have to speak the truth, and it has to be genuine. It can't be, you know, this. It has to be people that are true believers, that are not there for vanity's sake. And you know, there's this protectiveness towards the church that and towards the sheep that he warns against. He talks about that those that are like wolves that come in and devour. In 3 John, he spends most of his time here emphasizing on commending Gaius for who he is and how he's an asset to the church, and to continue that he needs to continue to utilize people who have a willingness to go out and serve in the gospel. You know, and we look at what's going on, and there's a lot of things going on in the church. There's Paul was plagued with the Judaizers that came and stirred up trouble. But we see in Paul's time, he had a lot of trouble in Asia. He had a lot of trouble in the Corinthian church. He had he said in 2 Timothy that the churches of Asia had rejected him, his teaching. So you know, there's things going on that not all is that easy, but it's like it always has been and always will be. People who serve the Lord have to know the difference between good and evil. And Paul identifies evil as to Gaius here in this epistle. He's not close by, so he's writing this letter. It's very short, but I guess he wants to encourage him before he comes. He's obviously, by inference here, he's already written to the church, but this influential man in the assembly, he's probably some leader or perhaps a recognized elder. He's taken a primary position amongst the elders. His name is Diotrephes. He rejects John's letter entirely that he sent earlier. Verse 9, it says, I wrote to the church, but Diotrephes, who loves to have the preeminence among them, does not receive us. And that's probably why he's not writing to the church here in 3 John. And after Diotrephes refused this letter from John, Paul obviously sent emissaries to the church. And again, Diotrephes steps forward and he refused them admittance. In verse 10 it says, therefore, if I come, I will call to mind his deeds which he does, prating against us with malicious words, and not content that he himself does not receive the brethren and forbids those who wish to, putting them out of the church. So this guy he's running off good people. John describes him as being proud and almost strutting around like he's the top dog. And we know from Christ's teaching and that God's people shouldn't be that way. Anyone in leadership should be a servant and should have that attitude of humility instead of the way he describes Diotrephes. Verse 10 also infers that he's spreading rumors concerning the apostle's character, he's stopping those who are sympathetic to the apostle John and the brethren. He's basically excommunicating them. He's basically saying that I'm the boss here, and it's a big problem. But he's writing this letter to one in the assembly. I guess because he knows that who he's writing to. He considers him a courageous and a godly man. But he obviously understands that Diotrephes is causing problems, and so he needs to write to him individually. Eventually, he said he's going to eventually visit their church in verses 13 and 14. But I've had enough experience in dealing with churches and that these things happen. We're not a big church, but we've been blessed especially the last 5-10 years. We haven't had big problems. That's a good thing. We don't. This church has gone through numerous trials in the years that I've been acquainted with it. People have come and gone, and things have gotten stirred up. But for the most part, this church has been a peaceable church. But I've been in churches that are just drama all the time. And it happens everywhere. And it's because personalities, people want to control, and people, they want to run the show per se. They're not applying godly principles. It's because everybody's not like Gaius is, as Paul points out here. So, you know, he's mindful to encourage Gaius in what he's doing, and he commends him for, you know, his faithfulness and his hospitality, his hospitable character, and being a friend to those workers in the gospel. Obviously, he's a very spiritual man, but he's mindful to do whatever he can to protect the church and help the word to go out. You know, Diotrephes is a man who hinders God's work. He stifles it, and you know, he's self-seeking and self-promoting and unloving and a proud person. You know, we see things, and we see these things happen. There's a record of others in the scriptures that have been that way, and it's always caused problem. So, you know, the early church is not exempt, neither are we, from these kinds of problems. One of the primary things that prevents these things is people who know God's word are able to defend it, and they're grounded in the truth. They don't just come here as an exercise of something that makes them good people. God's people are only good when they put on what God teaches, puts on the righteousness that comes from God. I think we all need to ask ourselves at times, you know, are we being a Gaius or are we being a Diotrephes? Are we reacting to things that go on in the church because maybe we're jealous, or there's a little bit of pride there because of what we know or what we don't know? You know, are we someone that helps the work, that protects the work of God, the gospel, the church, or are we somebody that hinders it and stifles the work? Or, you know, there's really a third category, and this is probably the biggest core of people within a church that causes problems, is people that condone it or they're tolerant of it. Usually, when there's a problem in any organization, it means that there are people that go along. They don't want to get involved or whatever the situation. But you know, God's people have always, and I don't think that God's people need to be ever in your face, or we always need to be respectful of leadership that is required. But there are ways to handle evil, and this is one of the things that's going on in the church here in this, whichever one of these Asian churches he's writing to. I don't think it really identifies, but you know, Gaius is if you look in the records, it's a common name back then, but there's no record outside of 3 John of who this person is. We wouldn't know who he was if it wouldn't been for this real short chapter here. But obviously, he's somebody that's well beloved and known at the time. So, and that's why he addresses him as the well beloved in verse 1. We can see that, you know, his whole life is, you know, commended to these fellow believers. His testimony, his whole life is a witness of God's love. that probably a couple of the words that we see often in John's Gospels here in his epistles is love and truth, but also witness. And it's found in verse 3. It's expressed, that word witness is the same word as in verse 6 where it says his report. In verse 12 we have the word bear record. And record, we're impressed that this man who helps God's work, he has a witness, a testimony to his love for his love and his love of the truth. That's brought out if you read the other chapter here in 2 John. It's always those who are walking in the truth, those who embrace the truth and love the truth. To a lot of people, truth isn't all that important. They feel that, you can moderate that. It's adjustable. As long as you're entertained by someone and it's a lot of people are they want to feel at ease. They want to be entertained. They want to, and I think we all by nature want to feel good, but there has to be a certain amount of duty towards the Heavenly Father, toward what He said and what He teaches. Some people feel it really doesn't matter what you say or believe as long as you're just a nice person. And there's others who feel, well, it's important what you believe and what you teach, but not necessarily how you live your life. There's people that get caught up in the Word and understanding detail in that, but you look at their personal life and it doesn't show that they're really embracing that truth in their life. These things, truth, and life, our lives, they have to be married together. You can't have one without the other. Every Christian life has to be a witness of the truth. That we've has to be expressed in our spiritual walk. Verses 3 and 4 he says, "For I rejoice greatly when brethren came and testified of the truth that is in you, just as you walk in the truth. I have no greater joy than to hear that my children walk in truth." So the most important thing is to walk in truth, not just have the truth, but you have to walk in it. Truth is something that should be enshrined in our life. Because we represent God, and if we are not walking in truth, we're taking God's name in vain, basically. So our witness to others is very important. We can be a good witness or a bad witness, but obviously Gaius has shown himself to be a good witness in helping the truth and it's not hindering. We see in verse 8 says, "We therefore ought to receive such as that may become fellow workers for the truth." That's what Jesus spoke. When he spoke on the Sermon on the Mount in chapter 5 and verse 16, he says, "Let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father which is in heaven." He didn't say, well, so that he hears your good works. People need to see our good works. Your testimony is very important. The whole point of our living here on earth as God's children is for the witness, for the record, for the testimony of love and truth. So in Gaius, we're given a personification of this walking in truth. And, it's the characteristics that we see in this man. In verse 2, he says, Beloved, I pray that you may prosper in all things and be in health, just as your soul prospers. What John's saying here is Gaius is spiritually healthy. He's hoping that he will be physically healthy too. That his physical health would correspond to his spiritual health, his vigor. Basically saying that his health would, he longs that his health would mirror his spiritual wealth. That's quite a common kind of commendation. And the other thing that we see is not only is he spiritually healthy, but he's openly hospitable. This man exemplifies hospitality in the early church here. It was something that he's known to do. In verse 5, it says that he opens his doors to strangers. He says that some of the versions say, and especially to strangers. Well, this is important because this is Gentile country, and this is I think that sometimes Christians miss this part of what kind of people we need to be. He obviously was openly hospitable to those that came to him, especially those who were preaching the gospel. The scripture has a lot to teach about being hospitable and how important that is. It teaches in Timothy and in the 3rd chapter, and then in Titus, it gives the descriptions of elders, how they're to be hospitable. In Romans 12, it talks about taking care of the widows, that those who are hospitable, that those are the ones that are to be honored by the church. In 1 Peter, it talks about, we're to offer hospitality without grumbling. In other words, we do it willingly. Hebrews tells us to be hospitable because actually it uses the word entertain angels unaware. In other words, it's saying that, you don't know who's this stranger is, but, you may be entertaining someone who God has sent to you, whether heavenly angels or whoever it is. The word angel simply means messenger, so it can be anyone. The New Testament is full of verses that tell us that we need to be hospitable. There's blessings from the Lord when we're openly hospitable, because we're not just ministering to the service of God, but to brethren and how would you say, prospective brethren. I remember we used to visit a church fairly often, and very often there was somebody after services that was just standing around, and it just bothered me that nobody talked to these people, and they just had to go home again. And I don't think that should ever happen. People come visit the church, they're there for a reason. And I don't know if they even know why, but I think that the churches very often fail their duty when they let people go away, and they don't reach out to those who have come across our threshold. There's a story in Luke 24 after Christ is crucified, and that I think is a good example of hospitality. Of course, these two were despondent because they had heard that Christ was going to be resurrected, but it had been 3 days, and let me read this beginning in Luke 24:29. It says, "But they constrained him, saying, 'Abide with us.' They've been walking along the road together. For it was toward evening, and the day is far spent, and he went in to stay with them. Now it came to pass, as he sat at the table with them, and he took bread and blessed and broke it, and gave it to them. Then their eyes were opened, and they knew him, and he vanished from their sight. And they said one to another, 'Did not our hearts burn within us while he talked to us on the road, and while he opened the scriptures to us?' So they rose up that very hour and returned to Jerusalem, and found the 11 and those who were with him gathered together, saying, 'The Lord is risen indeed, and has appeared to Simon.' And they told about the things that had happened on the road, and how that he was known to them in the breaking of bread." To me, that's just a wonderful story. These people opened up their home in hospitality, and they didn't know who this was. And this angel unawares happened to be the Lord himself to Jesus. Just an example to us that we need to practice hospitality. There's when our heart is open to folks, it's when we're hospitable, it means a lot. And for some people, it's easier to be, we may have a place where we can invite people, but I think hospitality is more an attitude than anything. Hospitality really is an art of making people feel accepted. It doesn't matter if you can invite somebody to your home for a meal or whatever it is, or you meet them on the street and you're cordial to them, and you show a care for them. You accept them, and we get that nature from knowing that God is merciful to us, and he was hospitable to us before we ever knew him. In James 2:14 through 16, it says, "What does it profit, my brethren, if someone says he has faith, does not have works? Can faith save him? If a brother or sister is naked and destitute of daily food, and one says to them, 'Depart in peace and be warmed and filled,' but you do not give them that which he is needed for the body, what does it profit?" Faith is we're told in the scriptures, it has to be proved by works. James does a good chapter to read to explain that. Faith there should be legs to people's faith. If you remember the story of the parable of the Good Samaritan, it's that Good Samaritan didn't just stick a tract in his pocket and walk off, or and just leave him laying there bleeding on the side of the road. It doesn't say that. It doesn't say that he stopped and witnessed to him. The thing that he did immediately is took care of his immediate needs. He had compassion on him, and I think a lot of people minimalize this whole teaching what's going on. We learn that we don't want to be like those the Levite and the Pharisee in that. But I think the bigger lesson is we need to be like the Samaritan. We need to have compassion for people. You know, I don't think that people are going to listen to the gospel that you have to share with them, which is a good thing, unless they realize that you care, that you accept them. The Samaritan was really, in this example, he was showing almost an unconditional love to the man that was in need, just as God did. So it was very he's practicing godliness, Christ-like. Our love has to be expressed in deeds, not just in words. In the first epistle of John, 1 John 3:16 through 19, it says, "By this we know love, because he laid down his life for us, and we also ought to lay down our lives for the brethren. But whoever has this world's goods and sees his brother in needs and shuts up his heart from him, how does the love of God abide in him? My little children, let us not love in word or in tongue, but in deed and in truth. By this we know that we are of the truth, and shall assure our hearts before him." This is John speaking. This is in the first epistle that he wrote here, and he's saying that, you know, you have to be all inclusive. This love has got to, you know, cares for people and has compassion on them, and, you know, they not only care for you know, their salvation, but their well-being too. In closing, Philippians 4:16 and 17, it says, "For even in Thessalonica you sent aid once and again for my necessities. Now that I seek the gift, not that I seek the gift, but I seek the fruit that abounds to your account." And the thing is, he brings out in verse 18, the next verse, he doesn't really care about the financial aid that he's given to his work, but he cares about what's in their heart. And verse 18 says, "As a sweet smelling aroma, an acceptable gift well-pleasing to God." That's what God cares about, that we're a pleasing offering. You know, that this is something that is in our heart to do willingly and with our love towards God. God bless you.